In my mini lesson on Matthew 18:18, I mentioned there are a few things that have changed since the Old Testament, and I would like to look at those things one at a time in other mini lessons as best as I can, starting with the one that I feel is definitely the most important, and that's salvation. That's not to say that any other part of the Bible is not important, but salvation is why Jesus came, why Jesus went through everything that he went through for us, why he laid down his life for us, and it determines what will happen to us after we're dead. So let's start there. Why salvation is important. John 3:16 through 18, I'm going to use an interlinear translation for this because I want to get as close to the original as I can, since a lot of people are familiar with at least verse 16. Thus indeed loved God the world, that the Son, the only begotten, he gave, that everyone believing in him not should perish, but possess life eternal. Not indeed sent God his Son into the world, that he might judge the world, but that might be saved the world through him. The one believing on him not is judged. The one, however, not believing already has been judged, because not has he believed on the name of the only begotten Son of God. The point comes up that saved people die all the time, just like the unsaved. We do have in the Bible, Romans 6:23, for example, the wages of sin is death. So how do we not should perish, but possess life eternal? Well, the word perish here is not die in our sense of death, but rather is actually permanent destruction. It is the description used for those who will forever be separated from God in hell, for they will never again have the opportunity for restoration with God. Revelations 20:14 through 15 puts it as this: Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone was found whose name was not written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. So when Jesus says we will possess life eternal, he is referencing that second spiritual death compared to life eternal with God, while Romans 6:23 refers to the first physical death. We see this again in Genesis 2:17, where it says, But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. The word used for die does mean die, but it has a deeper meaning of worthy of death. God was telling Adam two things here. One, he would physically be worthy of death. This was not immediate, for God wanted us to have the opportunity to be redeemed. It was, if it had been immediately, none of us would be here. We'd have been dead before we were born, since Adam and Eve wouldn't have lived to have children. This death goes back to Genesis 2:7, where it is written that God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. The word for breath is the word for breath, which is why it was translated that way, but when used of a creature, it is also the soul or the spirit. So the second thing death in 2:17 is in reference to is the spirit given in 2:7, 10 verses earlier, and was the immediate death. We were immediately separated from God, that spiritually we were dead. If you, like myself, struggle with this because it's new information, you're in good company. John 3:3 through 7, Nicodemus was coming to Jesus because he was trying to find out, well, what else did he need to do to be saved? He wanted confirmation of what he had been taught. And Jesus answered to him and said, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And Nicodemus said to him, How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter the second time into his mother's womb and be born? So we see here that Nicodemus was kind of confused by that. How are you born again? I mean, we're already born. And Jesus wasn't referring to that physical birth, because we haven't physically died. We don't need to be born again when we haven't died physically. So Jesus answered, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of flesh is flesh, and that which is born of spirit is spirit. Marvel not that I said unto thee, ye must be born again. Jesus said we have to be born again. And why? Because back in Genesis 2:17, we'll say it again, we spiritually died. This is why Jesus explains here that there are two births. A spiritual one, the one that died back in 2:17, and that's where it must be born again, and the physical one, which is the one that dies when we reach the end of our appointed time on earth. Jesus does go on to mention that God did not send him to the world to judge the world. There was another video that I did, and I mentioned a sign in it that said if Mary had had an abortion, we wouldn't be in this mess. Jesus says here that God sent him into the world to save the world. If Mary had had an abortion, we wouldn't have a way to be saved. We were, are, and will always be judged to hell until we are saved through Jesus. We see this also in Genesis 2:17. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Remember, the word die is worthy of death. Romans 5:12 says, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men for that all have sinned. So because Adam sinned in Genesis 2:17, his sin passed on to us. His worthy of death was given to all who came from him because he was separated by sin. I'm going to skip to verse 18 to complete the thought because 13 through 17 are parenthetical. Therefore, as by the offense of one judgment came upon all men to condemnation, even so by the righteousness of one the free gift came upon all men unto justification of life. To go into verse 18 a little deeper, for there is a wonderful understanding that comes from the more literal translation. Here is the interlinear. So then, as by one trespass to all mankind to condemnation, so also by one act of righteousness to all mankind justification of life. One trespass. Genesis 2:17. All mankind was condemned. This mess had nothing to do with Jesus, Mary, God, or any of that. It had to do with Adam and his choice. By one act of righteousness, John 14:6, Jesus saith unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father but by me. By one act. John 19:13, when Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, it is finished. And the word there is actually paid. So he's saying it is paid. And he bowed his head. He gave up the ghost. What was he paying? He was paying that sin debt in Genesis 2:17. And 2 Corinthians 5:21, this is in the Young's literal translation, for him who did not know sin, in our behalf he did make sin, that we may become the righteousness of God in him. So, by that one act of righteousness, to all mankind came justification of life. Because Jesus, as he said, it is paid in full. I have paid the debt. Adam was the cause of the world's judgment. Jesus was sent by God to save the world. And a person wrote a post on April 3rd about how he no longer believed in hell. A loving God would not send anyone to hell. I want to go back to John 14:6. Jesus said unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Jesus says there is one way. And God gave us the free choice to accept that way or reject that way. He tells us that without salvation through Jesus, we are judged worthy of eternal spiritual death, not by God's actions or decision, for He sent Jesus to save us, but because of our decision to reject that salvation.